In July of 1892, the richest man in the world was 3,000 miles away from his own factory, fishing in the Scottish Highlands, when he received a telegram informing him that his own private security force had just opened fire on his employees. 10 men were dead, dozens more wounded, and Andrew Carnegie, a man who had spent decades publicly positioning himself as a friend of the working class, who had written essays about the moral obligations of the wealthy, had given the order that made it possible before he ever left the country. He did not come home. This is the story of Andrew Carnegie, the man who arrived in America with nothing, became the richest man alive, and then spent the rest of his life trying to buy back what he lost in a single summer. You have probably heard his name attached to libraries. You have probably never heard what he did to build the fortune that paid for them. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what happened at Homestead, why Carnegie let it happen from 3,000 miles away, and the specific psychological mechanism he used for the rest of his life to live with it. That mechanism is still being used today by people who have never heard his name. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, into a family of hand-loom weavers. When industrial power looms made his father's trade obsolete almost overnight, the family sold everything they owned and borrowed money to emigrate to America in 1848. Carnegie was 13 years old when he arrived in Pittsburgh with, by his own later account, nothing but the clothes on his back. His first job was working 12-hour shifts in a cotton mill for $1.20 a week. He never forgot what it felt like to have nothing, and that memory would justify almost everything he did for the rest of his life. Within a few years, Carnegie taught himself to read telegraph code by sound alone, a rare skill at the time, and became a personal telegraph operator for a senior executive at the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was noticed, he was promoted, and crucially, he was taught something that would define the rest of his career: how capital actually multiplied. His mentor showed him how to invest small amounts in promising companies before they went public. Carnegie borrowed against his mother's mortgaged house to make his first investment in a railroad sleeping car company, and it paid him dividends for the rest of his life. By the time he was 30, Carnegie was earning the equivalent of several $100,000 a year, almost entirely from capital he had accumulated, not wages he was earning. You have probably been told that Carnegie's rise was about hard work alone. What actually happened was that he understood, earlier than almost anyone else in America, that owning a piece of growing companies mattered more than any salary ever could. In the 1870s, Carnegie made a decision that would define American industry for the next 50 years. Rather than diversifying across multiple industries the way most wealthy men of his era did, he committed entirely to one: steel. He pioneered what became known as vertical integration, owning not just the steel mills, but the iron ore mines that supplied them, the coal mines that fueled them, the railroads that transported the materials, and the ships that moved them across the Great Lakes. He controlled every single step of the process from raw material to finished product. By removing every middleman from the chain, Carnegie could produce steel at a cost his competitors could not match, and then price it low enough to make competing against him nearly impossible. By 1889, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than the entire country of Great Britain. By the time he sold the company in 1901, it was valued at approximately $480 million, over $15 billion in today's money. The efficiency that made Carnegie's fortune had a human cost that his public image carefully obscured. Workers at Carnegie Steel routinely worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with a single 24-hour break every 2 weeks. Wages were cut repeatedly as profits grew. Safety conditions were, by any modern standard, catastrophic. Historians estimate that by the 1890s, roughly 1 in 12 steelworkers in Pittsburgh mills was killed or seriously injured on the job every year. Carnegie, meanwhile, was writing essays. Specifically, an 1889 piece called The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the rich had a moral duty to use their fortunes for the public good, an argument that made him famous as a progressive thinker even as his own workers suffered under the exact system that generated his fortune. You have probably encountered a version of this contradiction in your own life, someone, or some company, that talks about values publicly while operating very differently in private. Carnegie didn't invent that pattern. He may have perfected it. In 1892, Carnegie's steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, was profitable beyond even his own projections. Rather than share that success, Carnegie and his operating partner, Henry Clay Frick, planned to cut wages significantly and break the steelworkers' union that had negotiated the previous contract. Carnegie deliberately left the country for Scotland before the confrontation began, publicly distancing himself while privately authorizing Frick to handle it by any means necessary. Frick locked the workers out of the plant and hired 300 armed Pinkerton agents to secure the facility and bring in strikebreakers. When the Pinkerton agents arrived by barge on July 6, 1892, a gun battle broke out that left 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton agents dead. The Pennsylvania State Militia was called in, 8,000 troops, to forcibly end the strike. The strike was crushed. Wages were cut. The union was broken for the next 40 years. And Andrew Carnegie, the man who had built his public reputation on caring for workers, never once returned to Homestead or publicly took responsibility for what happened in his name. Carnegie's reputation never fully recovered from Homestead. Newspapers across the country accused him of hypocrisy and cowardice, of hiding behind Frick while claiming the moral high ground on workers' rights. Even close friends distanced themselves. Carnegie himself later wrote in private correspondence that Homestead was the greatest regret of his life. He never fired Frick. He never publicly apologized to the workers. And he never lost a single dollar of the fortune that Homestead's brutal efficiency had helped generate. In 1901, Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan for the largest private transaction in American history at the time, and spent the remaining 18 years of his life giving almost the entirety of his fortune away. Carnegie funded the construction of 2,509 public libraries across the English-speaking world. He established Carnegie Mellon University, the Carnegie Corporation, and dozens of other institutions that still exist today. In today's money, his lifetime giving totals approximately $5 billion. But philanthropy on that scale did not undo Homestead. It didn't return the wages that were cut, or the union that was broken, or the lives that were lost on July 6, 1892. What it did was give Carnegie, and eventually history itself, a different story to tell about who he was. The libraries are real. The books inside them are real. And they were paid for, in part, by wages that should have gone to steelworkers who needed them more. What Carnegie discovered, whether he understood it consciously or not, is a psychological mechanism that wealthy and powerful people have used for as long as wealth and power have existed. Public generosity doesn't undo private harm, but it does something almost as effective. It changes which story gets told first. This is worth sitting with, because the mechanism isn't historical. It's structural, and it's still running today. Every time a company causes harm and responds with a donation, a foundation, or a public apology tour, it's using the same playbook Carnegie built. The generosity is often genuine. It's also, almost always, strategically timed. How many times have you judged someone's character by their best public moment instead of their worst private decision? Carnegie's real lesson isn't about libraries or steel. It's about the gap between what a person builds and what a person becomes known for, and how much control the wealthy and powerful have over which version survives. Carnegie wrote his own redemption story while he was still alive to benefit from it. Most people don't get that chance, which means most of us are judged by what we actually did, not by the version we'd prefer people remember. Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, having given away 90% of his fortune. He is remembered today primarily for libraries, universities, and a famous essay about the moral duty of wealth. 10 men died at Homestead, so that essay could be true. The question worth taking from this isn't whether Carnegie was a good man or a bad one. It's simpler and more uncomfortable than that. When you build something, a career, a business, a reputation, which parts are you quietly hoping nobody looks at too closely? If that question landed somewhere, subscribe. I post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the next video in this series covers Cleopatra, a woman who understood the mechanics of power and wealth 2,000 years before Carnegie, and whose story was rewritten by the people who defeated her. If you haven't seen that one yet, it's the ancient version of everything we just covered.